This will be an informal interview of Georgia Supreme Court Justice Robert Benham, who is a native Cartersvillian and someone that I've known for many years. We started practicing law here in Cartersville at about the same time, and I look forward to talking with you about your recollections of growing up in Cartersville, your family, and of course I want to talk to you a little bit about your experiences on the bench, both in the Court of Appeals and the Georgia Supreme Court. First, tell me about your family, your mama, your daddy, your brothers, anything you want to share with the audience about them.
Well, it's a pleasure to get an opportunity to chat with you about some of my family's history and some of the experiences here in Bartow County. I guess the best place to start is at the beginning when we first were brought to Bartow County. That was in 1845. That's the same year that the Georgia Supreme Court was created, and my family was brought here from South Carolina, from Lawrence County, South Carolina, and lived on the Benham plantation, which is right off Highway 41. The old place, yeah, the old place is still there.
Beautiful antebellum brick house.
Oh, it
that's
is.
on the left, right before you get to Highway 41.
And the house itself is built on what used to be an Indian lodge. And I think you can still see in the basement of that house where it was dug out as an Indian lodge. But then my great-grandparents were brought here then as slaves, and then that was the beginning in Georgia for the Benham family. And of course my relatives, some of whom were brick masons at the time, and then after freedom came in 1865, there were some 56 Benham slaves who were released from slavery, and they settled then in what is known now as the Mechanicsville community, right in the vicinity of the Porter Street Bridge. And my dad, until his recent death, lived in the same place where his family had lived since they were released from slavery. And my dad served on the city council for a number of years. And
more than 20, I believe.
Right, he served.
Was mayor pro tem.
Was mayor pro tem for a number of years, and he enjoyed public service. And my mom was in business. She had her department store downtown for a number of years, and she was a licensed beautician, and she had volunteer work in the hospital here for a number of years.
Your mom's maiden name was what?
Was Knox.
Knox.
And in fact, her family had also come from South Carolina, and my dad's family and my mom's family were held slaves on plantations that were about 15 miles apart. Of course, they never knew each other, and that plantation was between the Broad and the Saluda River in South Carolina. And both of the families came, my dad's family first, and then my mom's family later on to Bartow County, what was then Cass County.
Now, I believe your dad, Clarence Benham, at one time was the superintendent of the what we now call the Bartow Carver Park up on Lake Allatoona.
That's right.
And I know you know a little bit about that. Would you explain
my dad
that?
was the superintendent in the 1950s. Of course, during the era of segregation, you had black and white parks, but you had very few black parks in this state. In fact, you had only two, one in Atlanta and one off of in the Ackworth area on Lake Allatoona. And after World War II, John Atkinson, who had been one of the Tuskegee Airmen, I think he was one of the mechanics, came to Bartow County to start a park where he leased land, 300 acres, from the Corps of Engineers to create what he expected to be a black resort, similar to the American Beach in Florida. And he leased that land and started operating a park with a beach and with boat docks and all of those things. Later, the state came and offered an opportunity to create a state park.
And I believe that was the first state park in the state of Georgia that was exclusively dedicated and set aside for the black community.
It in fact was the only one that was designated with that purpose in mind. And then in the late that started in the late 40s, mid 50s, after the Alatoona Dam was created and the Etowah River was backed up. And then my dad came in as the first superintendent for that park, and we ran that park for a number of years, maybe a half decade.
And then I believe he went to work at Lockheed?
That's correct. He went to Lockheed, but in the meantime, my dad was the district manager for North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, and my mom was the manager for Afro-American Life Insurance Company. So they both had been in the insurance business for a number of years, and that was my first real exposure to that kind of experience, because my mom and dad worked in the insurance industry, and that is what I had intended to do, is work in the insurance industry later on. And then my dad had an office down in Marietta where he would go several days a week, and we would go to Marietta on weekends and then go to the office in Atlanta. And that's where you had the African American life insurance companies, North Carolina Mutual, Afro-American Insurance, Pilgrims Life Insurance, and several other African American insurance companies at the time.
Tell us about you. I know you have two brothers. One still alive. One died right about the same time your daddy died.
That's right.
Didn't he?
He and my dad died within 24 hours of each other, and not from a common ailment, both from different
I
ailments.
know that they both were successful in the military. Tell us about that.
You know, we have a family tradition, and I've understood that tradition when I was 12. Since I was 12 years old, my dad brought us together. There have been mainly boys and men in our family, very few girls in the family. But I remember when I was 12 years old, my dad called us together and he says, we need to talk about things. And I labored under the assumption that he was going to tell us about the facts of life and the birds of bees. So I had a great amount of anticipation. And he sat us down at the table. My mom had gone off, so I thought that that's what the conversation was going to be about. And he said 5 simple things. He said, this is what it takes to live in this family. He says, you serve your God. You sacrifice for your family. You share with your neighbors. If called upon, lay down your life for your country. And if found deserving, perform public service. And now you boys go play. And that was it. That was the talk. And so my dad had said he was a World War II veteran, and there was no doubt in our mind from early childhood that we would go into the military. So I had one brother who went in, my older brother, he was, all of us went into Tuskegee University and finished Tuskegee, and they went through the ROTC program, came out as second lieutenants. One went in the Air Force and the other one went into the Army. One became a full colonel in the Air Force and the other one a major in the Army, serving 2 or more tours in Vietnam. And then
that was Billy.
That was Billy.
And didn't Billy also like go to somewhere in the far Saudi Arabia?
That's right. He worked as a liaison with American forces and the Saudi Arabian Army, and actually trained members of the Saudi Arabian Army. He stayed there. I think he spoke the language, as he did in Vietnam. When he was in Vietnam, he lived and he led a Vietnamese battalion, I believe, and he lived with them and he spoke the language too. And so when the Vietnam War was over, my brother said, Billy, that he says, you know, I've got to be in somebody's war somewhere.
Yeah.
And so he signed up with an American corporation that provided training for the Saudi Arabian army, and so he spent a number of years training Saudi Arabian troops.
Now, your brother Clarence is the one who became a full colonel in the Air Force.
Right.
Is he retired now?
He is retired. He was an OSI officer, and so he spent most of his time investigating matters for the Army and the Air Force. And the thing about it is, by the time he was in the Air Force, I very seldom saw him in uniform. In fact, his neighbors never even knew he was in the Air Force because as an OSI officer, most of their operations are not for public inspection as such. And so he spent a lot of time, and I think he headed up the academy for the OSI officers for a period of time. But he retired in I believe it would have been the early 90s, and he's been retired for a number of years.
Now, you were the youngest.
That's right, the youngest of three.
And now your daddy put it on you about laying down your life for your country if necessary. So what did you do about that?
Well, the interesting thing was I was in law school in the late 60s. The Vietnam War was raging at the time, and my dad called me and he says, well, when are you going in the Army?
I can hear him now.
Yeah, he said, when are you going in? I said, look, I'm in law school, and in case you didn't know it, people are dying over there in Vietnam. He says, well, you have a commitment, you've enjoyed the benefits of a democracy, and you have to be willing to sacrifice for democracy, and I expect you to enlist in the Army or do something right away. And so what I did is I then got an ROTC, and I says, I'm working toward it. I spent 2 more years in ROTC because I had been in ROTC Basic in undergraduate school. And so I was commissioned as a second lieutenant at the same time I graduated law school. And then I went into the Army as a tank commander and served at Fort Bragg and Fort Knox for less than a year, and then the war was winding down, so then I was a reserve officer, and I was a captain in the reserve.
And how long did you stay in the reserve?
Oh, I was in the reserve for probably 6 years or so, 6 to 7 years that I was in the reserve as a captain.
Tell us about growing up in Cartersville. Where did you go to high school, and tell us about that.
Well, Cartersville was a rather insular community at the time I grew up. You know, you had the black community, and you had the white community, you had the black schools, you had the white schools. We lived in an area known as Summer Hill, and there's been a lot written about Summer Hill. Most of it has been very favorable. But my parents were very protective, so they sort of insulated us from some of the harsh realities of segregation. But what I remember most about is that my parents told us we could be anything that we wanted to be, that there were no limitations. And so we grew up having a lot of hope, a lot of faith, and a lot of confidence. And in the Summer Hill community was the Summer Hill Elementary and High School, and we attended that school, and that school has produced, I would say, African-American lawyers, maybe 6 or 7, who came through a segregated era, has produced several African-American doctors, and so in that era, the community was very supportive, and members from various sectors of the community did worked together a lot to solve some of the problems. One thing that is interesting, the Summerhill community and the black community produced several field-grade military officers too, because one of the officers was an African-American doctor from here in Bartow County, Dr. Harris, who actually was from Adairsville, and he served, I think he was a colonel, a full colonel in World War II, and he went on to become president of the Atlanta Medical Association at that time, which was a black and white medical association, but he was president of that association. But it was due in part to the support that he received here in Bartow County from the entire community, and a lot of people worked together across racial lines, across religious lines to solve a lot of problems. So I have to say that growing up in Cartersville was a wonderful experience. Of course, it had its drawbacks, but it was a supportive environment.
So what year did you graduate from Summerhill High School?
I graduated from Summerhill in 1963, and then went on to Tuskegee, then was Tuskegee Institute, Tuskegee University, and received a bachelor's in political science. And from there, well, while I was at Tuskegee, I went on an exchange program at Harvard and spent a semester at Harvard there, and then came back and graduated from Tuskegee. And then from Tuskegee, I went to the University of Georgia Law School and graduated in 1970. And then I received an LLM from the University of Virginia later on.
Now, when you got to the University of Georgia, were there any other African Americans in your class?
No, when I went to the University of Georgia, there weren't any other African Americans in the whole law school. And it was a...
You were the first.
I was the second. There had been an African American, Chester Davenport, there before I came. But when I got there, he was no longer there. And so it was sort of an unusual, we had 500-600 students in the law school, and I was the only one in the law school. And for the 3 years I was there were no other African Americans except 2 came my last year.
So you were the first African American to graduate from the University of Georgia Law School?
No, I was the second, because
right.
Chester Davenport
was
the first. He did graduate.
He graduated.
And I think he was there during the same time, almost in the era when Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes were there. As they were leaving, Chester was coming in.
I was at Georgia when Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes. When they came to the University of Georgia, that was my first quarter at Georgia. I had transferred there. And were you there then?
No, I was not there then. See, this was later on when I went to law school, because I went to law school in '67, so that was later. But I did have an opportunity to meet them and talk to them over a number of years, and became friends with them over a number of years.
Well, now, you graduated from law school in 1970. I think you and I started practicing law in Cartersville the same year, I think. Tell us about what brought you to Cartersville to practice law, back to Cartersville to practice law.
Well, it was interesting because when I graduated from law school, I had a military obligation, and so I knew I would be going in the military soon, so I had an offer to go to Atlanta to work with Atlanta Legal Aid as soon as I left law school. So I went to Atlanta Legal Aid and worked there for a number of months, and then I had a military obligation. And at that time, Judge Davis was the Superior Court judge here.
The only Superior Court judge, J.L. Davis.
And Judge Davis's son and I had been at Georgia together. We were at Georgia Law School together, and I And we had a chance to meet then, because I remember, being the only African American in law school, it was sort of a lonely experience, because there were a lot of my classmates who never even spoke to me during that era. And they were good people, came from good families and everything, but there were some traditions that they adhered to. And a lot of those guys now, and there were only 2 girls in the law school at the time too, but we have, a lot of us, even though we didn't get a chance to talk in law school, have become fast friends over the years.
None of them have their picture hanging in the University of Georgia Law School Hall either, do they?
Well, but I hope some of them are on the way.
Yeah, but you do, don't you?
Right, I do.
I know you do.
But they were all wonderful people. But what happened is that I remember very well, because I was there at the university, and one day this guy came to see me. And I knew him by name but didn't know him, and it was Jeff Davis, who was the Superior Court judge's son. And he came, he said, well, I want to welcome you to Georgia. He says, we're from the same hometown. If you ever need anything, you ever need any help, just let me know. I'm here for you, because we 2 homeboys. And I thought that was a grand gesture on his part at the time, because that was not an easy thing to do at the time. But he offered any kind of help he could early on when I was in law school, and I always, appreciated that kind of hand of friendship that he extended. And so then when I graduated law school, and I was here in Cartersville visiting with Jeff at the time, and so he says, well, let me take you over to my dad's office, and I went over to Judge Davis's office, and then his office was in Bartow Savings and Loan.
Yeah, right there on Irwin Street.
Right, and he made an interesting inquiry. He says, well, when you finish the military, where are you going to go practice? I said, well, I'll either go back to Atlanta, or I've had some offers from places out in California, places like that. And he says, well, you're from Cartersville. Why don't you come back home and practice law? And I said, well, I really had intended to come back here to practice law, but, he told me that, if I wanted to solve problems, then I ought to be willing to solve problems in my own hometown. And he said, I can't guarantee you're always going to be treated fair. He said, but I'll do my best to treat you fair as a Superior Court judge. He says, I know where you can get some office space right across here. You need to be in an office with other lawyers and things of that nature. And I talked to my wife, and that's how it all began. That's how I came here. And that same year I came, I think within a period of time, you came, John Lewis came, and we were all then young whippersnappers, and now we're old rats in the barn.
You set up a practice down on Irwin Street by yourself.
That's right.
As I recall. And what kind of cases did you handle?
Well, it was a general practice. Then, you didn't have lawyers specializing to any great extent. And so I set up a practice, and I tried a lot of cases, and I was actually trying cases all over Northwest Georgia. I actually tried some cases in Alabama. I was doing cases both in state court and in federal court, and did some matters down in Florida, and tried cases in a lot of superior courts throughout the state, not just superior courts, city courts and probate courts, and so it was I won't say that it was a bed of roses, but it wasn't as difficult as some people from Atlanta told me that it would be, because they told me, says, you out of your mind to go out in the country and practice law. And I said, well, that's actually where I'm from. And I found the reception much better than some people thought it would be.
You became the first member of the Cartersville Bar Association that was African American, and then, as I recall, not long after you came here, you became the president of the Cartersville Bar Association. About what year was that?
Well, it was late 70s, and I served 2 terms as president of the Bar Association, and we just had a wonderful relationship. I won't say it was free of problems. In life, you're going to have some problems, but I think the lawyers in the bar, were very cooperative. They were supportive, and I can remember when I opened my office, many, if not all, of the lawyers in town came by my office to welcome me. Some of them told me, you can come to my library, use my library. Some brought phone books that I could use. Some brought pleadings that they had used in cases before. And so it really made me feel welcome for the lawyers to come by.
I don't know if you remember this or not. I think you probably do, but in the mid-1980s, I came to your office one day and asked you to come in to practice with me, for us to form a partnership. Do you remember that?
I remember that very well.
And you told me that you appreciated it, but that Governor Joe Frank Harris, a native Cartersvillian, had indicated that you might be a candidate for an appointment to the Georgia Court of Appeals. Now, there had never been an African American who had been on the Georgia Court of Appeals or the Georgia Supreme Court. And I think I told you you were about half crazy. You remember that?
I think you did. I remember when you came and you
said, come on, man, you don't want to do that. Well, come on over here. You know, we need another lawyer, and you've got a good practice, and we can join together. And he says, thank you, but I'm going to hold out and see if I get on the Georgia Court of Appeals. And then what happened?
Well, that actually did come through. But what was really remarkable about that, and most people don't think about that, but at that time there were no African Americans practicing in any of the white law firms outside of Atlanta, and very few. The only one I knew at that time was Richard Sinkfield, who was a friend of mine, was practicing. So I thought it was a wonderful opportunity that you and your firm had offered, and it really was attractive. But I thought the offer on the Court of Appeals might prove to be a little more attractive in the long run.
You mean you'd rather be a judge in the Court of Appeals of Georgia than practice law with me and my, at that time, infamous partner whose name will go unmentioned?
Well, on hindsight, I thought it was a wonderful choice.
Yeah, I probably would have taken that deal too. But Joe Frank didn't call me, but he did call you. Tell us about that.
He called me, and I have to say that Judge Jerry White, who was our Superior Court judge, played a part in that too, because Judge White had mentioned to me this possibility of an opening, and he said something. He said, if you are willing to do it, I believe that every member of the Cartersville Bartow County Bar Association will support you.
And they did.
They did. That did happen. And the Judicial Nominating Commission, they said, this is probably the first time where every member of your local bar association is behind you and supporting you for this position. And the appointment was historic because you had never had an African American serving in a statewide elected position in the history of the state. And it wasn't since Reconstruction. You never had an African American serving, and though you had several serving in the legislature, in the Senate, none of whom had been elected statewide.
And so that was another first for you.
It was a milestone.
You ran after your appointment. In what year did you run a statewide campaign to be elected to the position that you had already been appointed to by the governor as you call it judge on the Court of Appeals, right? Not justice?
A judge on the Court of Appeals.
Okay, judge on the Court of Appeals.
That was in 1984. That shortly after being appointed, I had within 3 months to run in a statewide election. But let me sort of tell you, and this is sort of the way I was raised. When the governor and some people in state government had approached me about serving on the Court of Appeals, I then in turn called some other lawyers who were senior to me, especially African Americans who were senior to me. I said, well, there's going to be a position on the Court of Appeals. And I said, you know, you've paid more dues than I. Don Hollowell was one, C.B. King, several lawyers who had practiced much longer than I had, you know, gone through trials and tribulations and everything. And I called them and I said, you know, I plan to accept the appointment if it's offered. But if you are interested, I'm willing to step aside because I'm much younger and you paid more dues. And all of them said, you know, we'd rather support you. And that made me feel good. But I felt I owed it to them to say, you know, you've made many more sacrifices than I have, and I think you are deserving. And they all supported me, and it made me feel good. And a lot of people in Atlanta felt that even though I had been appointed, there was no way I was going to win a statewide race. I mean, you know, because nobody had ever been successful in a statewide race. And actually, I had 3 or 4 opponents when I ran in a statewide race, and I was able to win without a runoff. And what to me was even more miraculous is the support that I received from people here in Cartersville and Bartow County. It was phenomenal.
Well, you earned it.
But what I remember most is, you know, I was sitting there at home, and then people would come and knock on the door, some of whom I had never even met before. And someone said, well, I'm a school teacher up at Cass, and I'm going to visit my folk down in Americas, and I need your campaign literature so I could take to them down there. And that was it was just an humbling experience to see that kind of outpouring of support by people who I didn't know, but we all were neighbors because we lived here in Cartersville and Bartow County, and they were very supportive and helped in the campaign, and I will always be indebted to this community for that kind of support.
How long did you stay on the Court of Appeals?
I stayed on the Court of Appeals for 5 years, and then I was offered an opportunity to go on the Supreme Court. And so,
another first.
Another first. All right,
and tell us about that.
And you know, I was looking at it when these opportunities came along. I saw myself more as part of a process, and that process was a maturation process for all of us in Georgia. Sure, I was the first African American to go on the Court of Appeals in the Supreme Court. But I think it was something that we all shared in this state in terms of accomplishments and progress that we made in this state. We were moving forward. We were looking to weed people into the American dream rather than weed them out of the American dream. And I think Cartersville played a significant portion. And on hindsight, looking back, I think being from Cartersville, the kind of community we have, was an essential cog in the wheel to my success. If I had been from somewhere else, I don't think it would have come about as easily as it came about, because this whole community surrounded me, lifted me up, supported me and my family, and that's what this community has been about for a number of years, and I'm always indebted to the community.
And what year did you go on the Supreme Court?
Went on the Supreme Court in 1989.
Okay.
And then usually when you go on the Supreme Court, you stand in line for appointment to Chief Justice, and usually it would take 15 years or more. I was blessed that within 5 years, after I went on the Court of Appeals, my peers elected me. When I went on the Supreme Court, they elected me as the presiding justice. And then with a year or 18 months of that, they elected me as the Chief Justice. So 6 years after going to the Supreme Court, I was the Chief Justice.
Another first.
Right, another first.
And you served how many terms as Chief Justice?
I served 2 terms as Chief Justice, which it was sort of was unheard of at the time. Usually,
another first.
yeah, usually you serve 1 term and that's it. But my peers saw fit to elect me to serve 2 terms.
And am I right? Was that not another first?
That was, in fact, another first.
Boy, you're just racking them up, aren't you?
Well, you know, I just happened to be in the company of some very talented people, and we all were working together toward a common goal. And when I served as Chief Justice, our court was listed as one of the most progressive Supreme Courts in the country. And I think, once again, I just happened to join some dedicated and committed public servants and some excellent judges and jurists, and we worked together trying to improve the quality of justice in this state.
Well, I'd like to say, though, that I've had a few cases before the Georgia Supreme Court since you've been on that bench, and I had a few cases before the Court of Appeals while you were on that bench, and you have not always ruled with me. Now, I want you to explain that.
I can tell you without reservation, every time you were right, I ruled against you.
Well, thank you.
I ruled for you, really. But, you know, that was one thing about the process that, that I admire, and that is, in our appellate system, what we try to provide is some predictability, some certainty, and stability in the law. Because that's one place where citizens expect to be treated equally. And we try to accomplish that, and all citizens standing equally before the bar of justice. And one thing that we have to provide in addition to that equality is that in order for our businesses to operate, in order for our institutions to operate, they need to have a stable environment. And that's what we provide in the appellate process. We don't always get it right, but we try to give the succeeding litigants the same kind of justice the preceding litigants got at the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. And that we're proud of that the consistency we have in our rulings, realizing that in the legal process, especially at the appellate level, things move at a glacier pace. There aren't any drastic swings in the law one way or the other. They're gradual swings so that the stability can be maintained. And that's one thing that we've sought to do. And I'll hasten to say that we have some wonderful lawyers in this state. When I came to the bar, we had less than 10,000 lawyers in the whole state. Now we are approaching 40,000
Are we
lawyers.
really?
And one thing that we have stressed, and it was part of the time when I served as Chief Justice, is that we stress professionalism among lawyers, that lawyers aren't hired guns, that lawyers are community servants, and they are healers of the community. And you heal the community through the resolution of problems. You know, when I traced the practice of law back some 2,500 years to a small Greek city-state in Athens, where lawyers first gained some prominence, the 3 professions then were the law, the ministry, and medicine. And the citizens readily see where medicine is involved with healing the body, where the ministry is involved with healing the soul, but they seldom see that the real purpose of the lawyer and the law is one of healing the community. And I've always seen the practice of law and administration of justice as one of healing to the community and bringing the people together to resolve their problems. And I think we've moved along that way at a rather fast pace. And so in our professionalism commission, we stressed competence on the part of lawyers, civility on the part of lawyers, public service, and community service. We want lawyers to serve on boards of Emulsionary institutions, charitable institutions, and to serve in public office so that they can be attuned to the needs of the community and help in resolving some of the problems. Because though the law is there to resolve problems, and though the court system is there to resolve problems, the law shouldn't be the only standard. It's a common standard we all can accept because we have a very heterogeneous population. But we feel that sometimes the best solutions across the dinner table, across the conference table, across the backyard fence, where there is a give and there's a take, someone will express and accept responsibility, someone will be held accountable, and someone will say, I'm sorry. And when those three things happen, the healing process begins. And that's what we strive for, is reaching the healing process as soon as we can. Sometimes that can be accomplished in court in an adversarial system. In many instances, it can be accomplished in the homes, in the communities, in the churches, and in the civic group, where everyone will have a piece of the solution of the problem.
Well, this is 2008 when we're doing this interview. You've been on the Supreme Court, you said, since 1989.
That's correct.
Next year will be 20 years, not counting the Court of Appeals. How long are you going to keep doing this?
Well, I'm up for election this year. You know, we run every 6 years, and having now been on the bench almost 24 years, I'm proud of the fact that I'm still too young to retire. In fact, in order to reach the age for retirement, I'll need to stay on the court at least 4 or 5 more years.
Isn't it mandatory retirement at age 70?
At 70 is the mandatory retirement. No, it's gone up to 75. So that you have to leave at 75, but you can't leave before 65. So my wife fondly says that I went too young and stayed too late. So.
Well, tell us about your wife. Was she a Cartersville girl?
That's right. My wife and I were Nell. It's my wife. She's Nell Dotson, and we have 2 children, and we have grandchildren. But we were high school sweethearts, and so we've known each other almost all of our lives. Although she is considerably younger than I am.
She's a lot better looking than you are too.
That's true. That's true. And but we have. 2 sons, and of course that had been a tradition in our family. I think it's a genetic predisposition. We just have boys, but we now have some girls in the family, and we are proud, very proud of
Your boys are how old now?
I have a son who is in his early 30s, and then a son who is in his early 20s. One went to the University of Georgia and finished, and my younger son is now at Georgia Southern. And but neither one has decided to follow their daddy in the practice of law, and that's perfectly all right with me as long as they achieve at whatever level they can. And so I'm very proud of my family, proud of the grandkids, and really appreciate the support my wife has given me over the years. It's tough being married to a lawyer, especially a lawyer who's in a general practice where you have to go and come at all hours of the day and the night sometimes, and be out of town for a long period of time. And I'll have to share this sort of vignette with you. When I look back on my life in terms of my kids and my family, and I was a trial lawyer, and we tried cases, over a number of years, I remember, and I liked trying cases. I really liked trying cases. I loved the heat of battle, if that's what. And I remember I had been gone for 2 or 3 days trying a case. I think I was trying it in federal court, and I had been successful. And I came back, and I was walking up the driveway, and I had one son then, and he was 7 years old, and I had a sort of a swagger in my walk, you know.
Oh, say it ain't so.
And I had a swagger in my walk, and I was just feeling confident, and my wife was standing in the door, and she said, "I need to talk to you." I said, "Well, baby, you should have seen me. I really was terrific." And she says, "You can put that aside." She says, "Come in here a minute. I need to talk to you." And she took me into my son's bedroom, and she woke him up. And I was trying to tell her about the case, and she woke my son up, and she said, "Corey, in case you didn't know it, this man who wolfs down his food at the dinner table, this man who comes to Sunday school late and leaves church early, this man who makes cameo appearances in our home, in case you didn't know it, this is your dad." And of course, I saw this as a very weak moment in my wife's life and a weak moment in my son's life. And having, you know, served in adversarial roles, I believe that in the presence of weakness, I should go for the jugular. And I said, "Well, son, you need to start planning what you're going to be in your life." And I said, "You know, your daddy is a lawyer. All of our friends are lawyers. We have some cousins who are lawyers, and you need to be a lawyer too." And you know that Corey then, he sat up in the bed, and he wiped the matter out of his eyes, and he looked at me. He just looked at me. And he didn't say a thing. And there was just this silence that fell over the room. And now that I know, I think he probably thought about, you know, when he was younger, we made him take piano lessons, made him practice. But when he had his recital, his daddy wasn't there. And he probably thought about the little baseball games. We said, you know, you got to develop your body and your mind. And so we made him learn to throw and to pitch, to catch and to field, all of those things. And the first baseball game that he played, he wasn't able to hit the ball. And I wasn't there to tell him it's all right to miss a ball or two. And then I think he probably thought about, you know, in a small town like Cartersville, we have Easter programs. And we make our kids get a Bible verse, and we make them learn the Bible verse and say that Bible verse. And when my son stood up in front of the church on Easter to say his Bible verse, it was in his mind, but he couldn't connect with his mouth, and he stuttered and he stammered, and he ran out of the church in frustration. And I wasn't there to say it's all right to miss a speech or two in life. And I think he thought about all of that, and then that's when he just looked me in the eye and he says, "Daddy, I don't want to be a lawyer, because if you're a lawyer, you're never home with your children." And now you're talking about something that cut deep, that really cut me deep for a 7-year-old to realize those things, the importance of being there. But the beauty of that is I learned it young enough. He was only 7, and I could change. So I developed a habit, if I'm within 50 miles of home, I don't care where I am, I'm going home. And so when I went to the court in Atlanta, I knew my family was still here in Cartersville. So I came home every night because that was important. And then my second son, and then that came along, and then I spent time with them. I went to the baseball games. I went to all of the activities and everything. And they made me realize that no matter what profession you're in, life was designed, and your profession was designed to improve the quality of life. You need to spend time with your family. You need to spend time with your children. You need to spend time with your parents. And now upon reflection, I feel good because I was able to change what I was doing at that time. Spend time with my family. Was able to spend time with my parents. They're all gone now. My parents are gone. One of my brothers is gone. But I had that time to spend with them, that if my son had not brought it to my attention, I probably would not have done that. And I would not be the person I am now.
It's interesting that you have made the decision, apparently some time ago, that in spite of the fact that you have to travel to Atlanta every time you have to go to court, which is almost every day, to work at the judicial building at the state capitol every day, that you have stayed and your family have stayed in Cartersville when it would have been probably a lot easier on you and your family to move to Atlanta. Why have you stayed in Cartersville?
Well, it's because I believe the importance of family. I think my strength comes from my family. It comes from this community, the values that we have in this community, the fact that we have so many churches in this community, the fact that this community reaches out and supports you. And I said, you know, I go to Atlanta to make a living, but I come back to Cartersville for quality of life.
And you do that every day?
Every day, and sometimes since my wife doesn't drive to Atlanta, if there's a function, I come back and get her and I take her back. And I consider myself blessed to have a wife to come back to take to Atlanta. And I consider myself blessed to be in Cartersville. This, you know, sometimes in Cartersville, people don't realize what a wonderful community we have here, how we reach out. And there have been people over the years, and I could call names of who have worked across racial lines to solve problems. They didn't participate in any march. You know, they weren't, you know, signing petitions or anything like that, but they were working to fulfill the American dream for everybody here, not just for the privileged, but for the downtrodden, the put upon, the oppressed. And I've always been able to refer back to Cartersville in terms of an inclusive community and the things that they did here. And I can remember, people wouldn't remember her, Miss Naomi Henson, who was lawyer Judge Henson's wife back in the 30s, 40s, who was working to solve community problems back at that time when it wasn't popular. And there were a lot of people in Cartersville who were working to solve problems. Even at the state level, people would not have wanted Cartersville to solve the kinds of problems, but we were working, trying to solve problems. And that's what I really admire about this community, the support. When I came back to practice law, it was, you know, clients from all stratas of society who came because they realized we had more things in common than things that separated us. If we worked on the things that we had in common, the things that separate us would be less and less important.
Well, Justice Robert Benham, Georgia Supreme Court, Cartersville native, and longtime friend, it has been a pleasure to have known you all these years, and it has been a cherished pleasure to be able to participate in this interview. And I think posterity will look back on you as one of the finest and greatest things that ever came out of Cartersville. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it ever so much.